All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Cape. With us is special guest David Avallone. You might have seen his work at your local LCS with Elvira meets H.P. Lovecraft. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Perfect. We are glad to have you. The Elvira comic series is one of my favorite. Especially Horrorland and Monsterland was very fun to read. That was great. Now, you've also done quite a bit with the Dynamite as well with Betty Page, and I thought I saw Zorro.
Zorro wasn't Dynamite. Zorro was for a company called American Mythology, which had the license for a bit. And you know, I got to say, American Mythology, not a lot of people read their comics, and with zero humility, I'll say that series was great, and I wish more people had read it because I'm incredibly proud of it. It's it's one of those things where American Mytho is a small company and they don't pay a lot, but when they told me they were offering me a Zorro series, I kind of couldn't. 12-year-old me would not have forgiven 50-something-year-old me for saying no to writing Zorro as one of my favorite characters. So I'm glad that I got to write him and talk about him and the history of Los Angeles and all of the stuff that you get to write about when you write about Zorro.
Oh, definitely. I would say Zorro is such a underutilized character, considering how much story there is to tell, even from a modern tale.
Well, and how influential he is. There's a sort of trail of influence, and I think to find the first Batman, you have to go back to the Scarlet Pimpernel, putting on a funny costume and fighting the French, and then you got Zorro. About, I don't know, 50 years later, 30 years later, I can't remember the publication history of Scarlet Pimpernel. And then you've got the Shadow and the Spider.
Yep.
And then you've got Batman. And they're all great characters, and I'd like to write all of them. But Zorro, I love Zorro's joy. I think too many people write Batman as kind of a depressed, morose guy, and you can't write Zorro that way. Zorro is having a great time fighting for the oppressed. Which I think you should have a great time, like Robin Hood. You should have a great time fighting for the oppressed. It's a good gig if you can get it.
I mean, that's what makes it fun to read. You know, he gets the women, he's liberating the towns, he's a hero. He knows he's a hero, and he gives into that ego, which to agree is fun. And Batman just like, you know, I stopped Gotham from getting destroyed. What now? It's like, all right, well, let's have a little bit of a party.
Someone smarter than me once observed that Dark Knight Returns, while it's great in and of itself, it told a lot of writers that that's how you write Batman, and it's like, no, that's lost, tired, exhausted. He's killed a couple of Robins, Batman.
Yeah.
That's not 35-year-old Batman who has friends, who, has a life, has a girlfriend. He's a much happier guy than Frank Miller's bitter retiree. And you don't have to write him that way. You can write him with a little more joy and a little more fun. It doesn't mean you have to go all the way to Adam West. But Adam West, to me, that's still a valid way to play Batman. Maybe it's my age and my generation.
It's an iconic Batman.
But it's an iconic Batman. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, what's really impressive is you have quite a listing. I don't know if the comics came first or intertwined, but you're also director, screenwriter, actor.
The comics came. I moved to LA in 1987. Right out of college, and worked in the film industry off and on and I still do plenty of work in the film industry, including I write Batman for Batwheels, which is a kid show on Max. None of my episodes have dropped yet, which is driving me crazy because kid shows, they don't do them like a Netflix show. It's not a show every week. They dropped 5 episodes of the second season a month ago, and that's what it. I have no idea when anything else is coming, but eventually there'll be 3 episodes out there that I wrote, and that was a real thrill. But yeah, at the age of 49, I was a little bit burnt out, still doing all of the things that I was doing, writing and directing, and having I always used to say I was just successful enough to not quit.
Yeah.
I made just enough movies. I made just enough money to not say I'm done with this. But a colleague, someone I was working with, read an old script of mine when in 2013, 2014, and said, I can't help you get any movies made, but have you ever been interested in writing comic books? And I have. I'm a long time, reader since I was a little kid. And they introduced me to some comic book editors and said, hey, this is David Avallone. He can really write. And I met Joe Rybant, the editor-in-chief of Dynamite, for drinks at San Diego Comic-Con. And we really hit it off. And, we didn't really talk about comic books. We talked about movies we liked. We talked about books and culture and all that stuff. And at the end of the conversation, he said, well, let me go back to New York and see if we've got something that you would be good for. And I think one of my attractions to Dynamite at that time was they had all of the pulp licenses from the 1930s. Yeah. They had The Shadow and they had Doc Savage. I was raised by a pulp writer, 1950s Private Eye character named Ed Noon, written by my dad, Michael Avallone. But he was a kid in the 1930s. And he loved Doc Savage and he loved The Shadow, and the paperback re-releases of those from the 60s and 70s were in my house growing up. And one of the things I said to Joe is, if you want someone to write The Shadow and Doc Savage who doesn't have to go to the Wikipedia page and find out who they are, I'm the guy. Me and Matt Wagner are probably the two comic book writers who don't need it explained to them who The Shadow is or who Doc Savage is. Comic book writers, under 80 anyway. So I did eventually get to write The Shadow and Doc Savage, but the first thing I did was a steampunk Vampirella series called Legendary Vampirella.
Yes.
And to audition for that job, I had to call up Bill Willingham, who had created that steampunk universe called Legendary, and tell him what I was going to do with his characters. And Bill liked what I had to say and liked what I pitched. So we went forward with that. And Dynamite has more or less always had a comic for me to write. In the beginning, there were more gaps, but particularly since I took up the Elvira thing 5 years ago, which is half of my comics career years ago, there's always been something that they've wanted me to write. So that's been great. They've been a great publisher for me.
Definitely. Well, it's funny you say The Shadow, because the only reason I know him is my grandfather grew up. He was a ventriloquist, popular out here in Chicago, and he did a lot of old time shows. He would recreate them with people. So I have like 200 video cassettes of them redoing The Shadow. So I know the whole intro, all of his powers, the defying. So yes, I love The Shadow. I would love to see that come back.
He's a great character, and distinct from Batman in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And the one Shadow thing I did get to write, the 4-issue miniseries, was very unique. It was a crossover with the Twilight Zone TV series premise. And I initially said, wow, that's interesting, because the Shadow is sort of the Twilight Zone embodied in a person. Because if you think about the Twilight Zone, normal human being who has some sort of difficulty or complex or problem encounters the Twilight Zone, and basically they change or they die. They learn something from their encounter with the uncanny and they evolve, or something terrible happens to them because they don't learn and they don't evolve. And I said, that's essentially, the Shadow is just sort of the in-person version of that, where either you go to work for him or he saves your life or he fills you full of bullets because you're a bad person. So it was interesting finding, I said, so do you want the Shadow as an embodiment of the Twilight Zone? And then went, no, we want a Twilight Zone type story to happen to the Shadow. I was like, so that's, what can you teach the man who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? And what I came up with, which I think is valid, is the one thing the Shadow doesn't have is mercy.
Yeah.
He is merciless. And you can argue that justice is merciless, but the premise of the comic is there is no justice without mercy. And that's the lesson that he has to learn by the end of the series. And I have to say, the Twilight Zone was a huge influence on me. And, they told me you can't use Rod Serling's face.
Yeah.
You can't really use anything from the show except the, premise and twist ending, and that's it. But what I did do is I wrote the narration in as close an approximation to Serling's very specific style as I could. And that was just an absolute joy. And the best reviews that it got, pretty much unanimously, people said, hey, this really sounds like Rod Serling, this voice. And, I mean, no disrespect to his writing at all, but like, that man could torture a metaphor like nobody's business. And
yes, he was very good.
I tried to, there's one issue that's like, I'm trying to remember exactly how I worded it, but like the Shadow's real name in the pulp magazines is Kent Allard, distinct from the radio show where he's Lamont Cranston. And it says, for Kent Allard, the unusual is as common to him as breakfast. The uncanny, his buttered toast. The macabre, his hot coffee. It's like I would never write that.
No.
Coming from me, but coming from the narrator of The Twilight Zone.
Correct.
On an ordinary day, an ordinary man can expect to recognize the face in the mirror. But Kent Allard is far from an ordinary man, and he is not having an ordinary day. Like that pattern and that rhythm is so fucking great. And it's not me at all. It's not generally how I write, but having the ability to do that and to torture a metaphor was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, that I'm gonna have to look that one up because The Shadow will always remain one of my favorites. Now it's funny that it's getting really weird because the more people I interview, the amount of them that are screenwriters that are getting into comic books is a lot. And I always said it actually makes a lot of sense because you guys are so formulaic to a degree with, I have to set my scene, I have to set my stage.
Sure.
Obviously it's not easy to convert it to comics, especially when you've never made one, but you have almost a better layout, at least kind of understanding like, all right, well, I only got so much.
Screenwriting is similar to comic book writing mostly in that, it's a format with limitations, but I think Neil Gaiman once said that a comic book script is a letter to an artist.
Yeah.
Like you have a slightly bigger audience than that because the editor is going to read it and the letterer is going to read it and all that. But mostly it's a set of instructions to an artist or suggestions. And a screenplay is the same thing. Is a screenplay, while they can have literary merit on their own, it's how to make a movie kit. Here's the things I need you to do. Here's the things I need you to pay attention to. But that said, the funniest thing to me when I started writing comic books was screenplay format is pretty rigid. There are people that break it, and once you get famous enough, you can do crazy shit like Christopher Nolan writes his screenplays in first person, which I think is really. I feel sorry for Florence Pugh having to read a sex scene with her in the first person. That would have creeped me right the hell out. But screenplay format is pretty rigid. It is what it is, and you're expected to do a certain way, and it's supposed to look a certain way. And the greatest shock to me was that comic books, every writer uses their own format. Yep. And I will say that I got a format early on from a colleague that I did not like at all, but he was someone writing for Dynamite and was successful in the field. So I was like, okay, I'll use this format because this is the only format that anyone has offered me, and I'll start writing in it. But I really didn't like it. I thought it was very counterintuitive. Like you had the dialogue, which is going to be in all caps in the comic, was lowercase and centered like a movie script, but the screen directions were in all caps. The panel descriptions were in all caps. I'm like, that's so hard on the eyes, but okay. And then when I started working with Kevin Eastman about 2015, 2016, I sent him the first script for the first issue of Drawing Blood, and he said, "Hey man, what's And Kevin's great. Kevin's one of the
Yeah.
greatest guys in the industry. He's like, "Hey man, what's up? Your format's whack, dude. Like, don't let me send you something." And he sent me a Tom Waltz Ninja Turtle script from the current ongoing series at the time. And I said, "Oh, this is much better. There's no dumb tab stops. There's no weird capitalization for no reason." So I made one change, which was Tom didn't number his balloons. And I'm a big believer in, I think it's way easier to communicate with the letterer by saying page 5, panel 4, balloon 3,
Yeah.
change it to this, instead of on page 3, panel 4, where he says blank. The numbering just makes it really clear to me. But I made that one change, and that's the format I've used ever since. And I'm very happy with it. But it surprised me. And I will also say, I think a lot of film people go into comics and don't take it particularly seriously in terms of the format. And you can kind of tell that they haven't studied it, and they're just literally breaking their movie scenes down into panel descriptions without really caring how it breaks. When I learned about page turns in comics,
Yes,
it blew my mind, and it entirely controls how I write a comic book. And for those listening who don't know, when you're reading a physical comic, the even numbered pages are always a page turn. The odd number pages are always something the reader can see out of the corner of their eye while they're reading the even number pages. So a thing you can never do is have a big reveal on an odd numbered page. And yes, sometimes you got to tap dance for a page and tread water and come up with stuff to do to keep the main character from opening the door and seeing the monster, because he got to see the monster on page 4. He can't see it on page 3. Because if he sees it on page 3, the reader looking at it in their hands is going to go, "Oh, look, there's a monster coming in the next page." So once you know that, it's like in TV shows, you have in network TV shows or TV shows with commercials, you have the commercial break, and you end an act on a cliffhanger, on a question that the audience wants an answer to. You have to do that every 2 pages in a comic book. You have to, and it doesn't always have to be opening a door and seeing a monster.
Yeah.
But it has to be question, answer, setup, punchline, anticipation, revelation. And once you get into that mode, it's hard to get out of it. Every once in a while, you have too many revelations coming hot and fast on top of each other, and it always drives me crazy when I have to have something big happen in the middle of an odd numbered page. I'm like, yeah, I got something else big coming in 3 panels, and I can't tap dance for 2 pages to hold off the thing that's happening on the page turn one more time. So all of it's going to happen here. But in general, I'm pretty strict with myself with keep the thing moving like a bullet, keep the audience turning the pages, keep them, in Elvira, it's a very different thing. Comedy is so different from writing anything else, because I better be funny at least every other panel, if not every panel. Everything's got to come with a joke. Every once in a while, you can let it go because you're telling the story, or there's a beat that's not funny or whatever, but Elvira's got to be funny. And that is a higher bar than an adventure comic. An adventure comic, everything I write, I like to think is at least a little funny, because everything in life is a little funny. I've never been to a funeral that nothing funny happened at. I've never been in a hospital room where there was nothing ironic.
Oh, yeah.
Comment. You know what I mean? There's always some element.
Working in surgery, I can tell you for sure. Yeah. There's nothing
there's always some element of life worth cracking wise about, I think. Yeah. And maybe that's a character flaw. So I don't believe in something just being absolutely unremittingly grim. As a matter of fact, the grimmer something is, the funnier a good joke placed within it can be, because it's such a release from tension. Anyway, I'm rambling, but yeah, learning how to, and I had a lot of help from artists, particularly
Yeah.
David Avallone, who drew. We haven't had as much a chance to work together recently as we used to, though he's still doing covers for everything. I used to never use captions because I did a very cinematic style. If you read Doc Savage, Ring of Fire, everything in that comic is a sound. Everything that's on the page is a sound you would hear if you were watching it in a movie. There are no caption panels. And at a certain point, Dave said to me, like, let comics be comics. Use captions. It's okay. You're allowed to. And I will admit that I have mostly used captions. I still kind of need them to have a voice. So, like, the captions in Betty Page, I had it be her diary that she's narrating. So it allowed me to use, caption boxes. Drawing Blood is narrated by the main character. And the one time I tried to use caption boxes that weren't a character was Zorro. And spoiler alert, the voice had kind of a whimsical, omniscient quality for 3 issues. And I had no particular idea. It's a God's eye view of what's happening. And I get to the 4th issue, and Zorro meets, because it takes place in California at the turn of the 19th century, I did a lot of research on the indigenous peoples of Los Angeles, the Gabrielino Indians, the Tongva, and I learned about Tongva mythology. And Zorro actually comes face to face with the Tongvan goddess of death, whose name is Tomalok, who lives in a place called Shishangna, which might be heaven, might be hell. That part of the mythology hasn't survived to the 21st century, so we don't really know. And when he started talking to Tomalok, I went, oh, this whole thing has been narrated by the Tongvan goddess of death. That's who's telling you this story. Because the way I was writing her, I went, oh, she's the omniscient, whimsical figure telling the story. And I reached out to the letterer, and we had been doing the caption boxes in this sort of faded brown background and script. I said, her Tomalok's dialogue boxes should be the faded dark brown with the elegant script, exactly like let the audience know this is who's been telling the story all along. And I was very satisfied with that experience and with how that turned out. But it was funny to me that I couldn't get through a whole series without the narrator actually being a character that you met, without the person telling the story being an actual character in the comic. I still haven't. Every once in a while, there's caption boxes in Elvira, but they're usually very clearly me.
Yeah.
Because of all the fourth wall breaking in Elvira, it's Avallone speaking as a character in the book when you get that.
Yeah, I mean that's the funny part. I think that was the funniest thing with issue 1 of the Elvira meets H.P. Lovecraft, is kind of referring to yourself in the comic book and like the work. I think a lot of people, when you read that, like that comic book with that comedy, I think a lot of people appreciate it. Now it is funny that you mentioned that the page turn was a lot, because they have mentioned that to me. The other one that they really hated was the final page introduction. He's like, I don't like starting a new thing and now I have to end it. He's like, it drives me so crazy.
I love I don't know if you ever read Keith Geffin's Ambush Bug, but the way he did he always used to love doing, because it's such a comic book cliche, the last page turn to page 22 or 24 or whatever it was at the time was usually Darkseid.
Yeah.
Darkseid at the door, Darkseid working as a fry cook at McDonald's, like always like, oh my God, it's Darkseid. And I do that. I kind of enjoy the page turn. I've never gotten a chance to write Darkseid, but I've done some Cthulhu page turns and, evil space overlord page turns, and because I just think it's fun, and I think it's the tricky thing, and it's the same thing as writing episodic television. I don't believe I thing that I hate the most on television. My friend uh, Javier Grillo Maxor refers to it as the churn. When an episode or an issue doesn't have its own contained story,
Yeah.
it's just all of the plot threads, the A story, the B story, the C story, they all move forward in some way, but nothing resolves. I hate that. And I'd like to think I've never done an issue like that. There's always some thing introduced in page 1 that is wrapped up in one way or another by page 20. Sometimes I do it in the most obvious way, like in Horrorland. It was just the last page was always the jump to the next movie that you're going to read about in the next issue. So the reveal was always, oh, the next issue is going to be The Shining. Oh, the next issue is going to be Alien. Oh, the next issue is Freddy Krueger. Like that was my version of Dark Side on the last page. But I tend to do comics in a very modular way of like, this issue is going to be the ones with this location and this problem or threat. And even though the overarching problem or threat or story will continue, we will no longer be in this location dealing with this specific thing. We will move on to the next step in the journey. And comic books, and episodic television lend themselves to that. To the, soap opera is a definite thing, but it's the Star Trek thing, which they've gone back to a little bit with Strange New Worlds of new episode, new planet. Man, like, yeah, there are overarching storylines. Nurse Chapel is in love with Spock. Dr. Mbenga is trying to save his wife. Captain Pike is worried about his fate, which was revealed to him. But while we service those things, in this episode, we're on a new planet. There's a new story. We're going to wrap that story up by the last commercial, by the last act, and then we're going to move on to the next thing. And so I do everything in my power to avoid the churn and to keep things moving.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that, having read most of your Elvira work in my collection, which
Thank
obviously
you.
is the reason we're here. Elvira meets H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how this was going to go because I'm like, oh man, Vincent Price was so much fun. I would never have thought to do that.
Yeah, and I will be honest, I did not think to do that. Dynamite reached out to me and said, so we've made a deal with Victoria Price. Would you like to do a 5-issue, pitch us a 5-issue Elvira meets Vincent? Actually, it was a 4-issue Elvira meets Vincent Price. They've actually started giving me 5 issues to begin with now, because that was the last. There were a bunch of times I've been given 4 issues, and then somewhere in issue 2 they say, wow, number 1 sold really well, and you tack a 5th. And I'm like, no, that Elvira and Vincent Price story absolutely wraps up in the 4th issue, and I'm not gonna give you another issue of that storyline, but I'll do an epilogue. I'll do a new adventure that can be begin and end in 1 issue. So I've gotten pretty good at epilogue. But now Dynamite is just like, it's 5 issues. Like let's just start off with it being 5 issues. So they came to me with the Vincent Price thing, and by sheer coincidence, the day I had to this is the magic of how writing works sometimes. The day I had to pitch a story for that, a colleague posted a blog about this lost Vincent Price movie that it turned out really didn't exist, called The Ares Computer. And the story was that some producer wanted to make 12 horror movies based on the sign of the zodiac. And the signs of the zodiac, the first one was going to be Aries. It was going to be called The Ares Computer. It was going to star Vincent Price and can't remember the actress. It was some second B-level former Bond girl, I think, was the actress in it. And never got made. Project never got off the ground. But because this was 1971 and the year before the internet, some doofus making a guide to the movies that were released in 1971, instead of actually seeing movies, went through Variety and looked at what was in production and wrote reviews for all of them, including ones he hadn't seen, including the Ares computer. So it got printed in books. And then, equally lazy people then like added it to Vincent Price's filmography. Well, it's reviewed in this book. And so long story short, if you go to IMDb and look up the Ares computer, it's there. And trivia item number 1 is this movie was never made. So like, okay. And why does it have an IMDb page 50 years later? So long story longer, I went, okay, well, why? Maybe we can come up with a conspiracy as to why the movie was going to destroy the world. The movie was going to save the world. And since Ares, I didn't want to really screw around with the Zodiac, but since Ares is a ram, I started thinking about gods and pantheons. And I went, well, the kind of the chief deity in Egyptian mythology is Amun-Ra, who has a ram head. So let's make it an Egyptian cult thing. And so it became a movie called Rise of the Ram, which was made but then suppressed by Amun-Ra cultists who claim that one of the actors reading from the Egyptian Book of the Dead on screen would actually like bind Amun-Ra for all eternity in the Western lands and all that. And it was huge fun to do that. And yes, Vincent Price is the exact opposite of H.P. Lovecraft. He was a lovely guy. He had a great sense of humor. He had a fluid sexuality, which we're not sure that H.P. Lovecraft didn't die in incel. So very, very, very different character, and a joy to research and find out more about. And as I like to say, it's the greatest compliment I have ever been paid in silence. Torrey Price had complete control over the script and said not one word to me.
Yeah.
I did not get a single, my dad would never say that. My dad would never do that. She didn't punch anything up. She just, this is all good. I like it. So that was flattering and very nice. And then we get to Lovecraft, and I had originally intended to do Lovecraft in issue 4 of Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, because I did Shelley and then Poe and then Bram Stoker, and Lovecraft is really sort of the next step in that evolution. But I felt 20 pages was just not enough to wrestle with the real H.P. Lovecraft and how complicated a character he was. So when I wrapped up Monsterland, like you, I had so much fun with Horrorland and Monsterland. It allowed me essentially to do Mad Magazine movie parodies of every horror movie that I love. But I kind of felt like 2 series in a row, 10 issues set in the multiverse of movies was a lot. And I may go back to it, but I just didn't want to come up with a contrived reason for Elvira to once again be hopping around through movies. Who knows? The next series I do could be that again. But I thought, let's go back to H.P. Lovecraft and let's wrestle with that legacy, and because it's certainly, I've read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. I'm even lucky enough, he's gone now, but H.P. Lovecraft and I had friends in common, authors who have since died. One of whom, Robert Bloch, does appear in a future issue of Elvira and meets H.P. Lovecraft, because I loved Bob and he was a great guy. And I get to do like a 4 or 5 page tribute to Bob in, I think, issue 4.
Awesome.
Because Bob was a colleague of my dad's, and I wrote a poem based on the Lovecraft mythos. It was mostly like a writing experiment, even though I was like maybe 10 or 12. Like, how do you make all of those names fit in a poem? What rhymes with Nyarlathotep? What rhymes with Yog-Sothoth? So I wrote a poem based on the Lovecraft characters, and my dad, without telling me, sent it to Bob because he thought Bob would get a kick out of it. And Bob was very encouraging and said really nice things about it. So anyway, long story short, I decided, okay, bite the bullet and let's talk about it. Let's talk about H.P. Lovecraft. And so far, the critical reaction to the book has I haven't read anybody say they didn't like how I handled the character from either direction. I haven't I haven't read any reviews from racists saying I was too mean to H.P. Lovecraft, and I haven't seen any like far left reviews saying I wasn't hard enough on him. Usually, it's been pretty, and I think there's some ambiguity about the character that will be resolved down the road. You're meant to be, he presents himself as having changed in the story and having learned something from floating in the void for 80, 90 years since he died. You're meant to view that claim skeptically. What is truly in H.P. Lovecraft's heart and soul, you'll find out by issue 4 or 5. That's the most I can say. But yeah, I wanted to deal with him because he's a complex guy, and I think it's hard to think of another author as influential who I don't think people read that much.
Yeah.
I think the world is, and this is not a critique, by the way, but the world is full of people with like Cthulhu plushies who I don't think have ever read a word of H.P. Lovecraft because that's not how they encountered it. They encountered the mythos in comic books, and Cthulhu's been on South Park.
Yeah.
Like the character's been around a lot. So, and I did a whole run in Betty Page Unbound 1 through 4. Betty goes up against the great old ones one at a time, and ends up with the 4th issue, which takes place on Rillier, and she goes up against all of them. And that was a fun story. This is a very different take on it. But yeah, you can't get around Lovecraft's influence.
Oh no, yeah, huge.
Yeah.
And it's fun too. I mean, the nice thing is you have H.P. Lovecraft, which, having read a lot of his old stories, he seems like he'd be a dry, very almost pessimistic kind of guy. And here you have, Cassandra Peterson's Elvira, the complete 180 of that character. It's a nice contrast in the story.
Yeah, well, that's ultimately, I think, what talked me into doing it is that I knew that Elvira wouldn't take any shit from him, wouldn't stand around and let him say racist shit without calling him out on it. And that's irresistible. And also, there's a line in a later issue where she points out that he makes some comment about her being, not as polite as the women of his time. And she's like, dude, the women of your time couldn't vote until you were in your 20s. Like you grew up in a world where women couldn't vote. They weren't polite. They were biting their tongue and not telling you to your face you were an asshole because they couldn't get away with it. I can get away with it now. So it was and by the way, I am not one of those people that will say about any historical scumbag, jerkwad, racist that, but people were like that then. Nonsense. There were plenty of people in Lovecraft's time who were not shithead, racist, sexist. It was, was it more common than it is today? Absolutely. Was it more prevalent? Was it more socially acceptable? Absolutely. That doesn't mean there were no racists.
Yeah.
It's like the founding fathers. John Adams didn't own any slaves. So, it was possible to be a guy in Congress in 1776 who thought slavery was bad and didn't want to own any and kind of wished he could get it into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that slavery was bad and wrong. So that argument of like, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson, everybody owned slaves. No, everybody the fuck did not own slaves. That's not the situation. So yeah, no. I never give Lovecraft a pass for that. I think that he was a remarkably sheltered person, and that didn't help.
No.
That he was afraid. He was afraid of everything. And there are a bunch of jokes about that in upcoming issues. That he There's one, he calls something unnerving at one point, and Elvira says, dude, you thought seafood was unnerving. Like, of course you're afraid of air travel and cars.
Yeah.
like crab legs terrified you. How can you help a guy who's afraid of a lobster?
Now, have you met? I mean, I'm assuming with Dynamite having the rights, like, have you been in a phone call or interview with the original Elvira, Cassandra?
Sure. I would go so far at this point, 5 years in, to say that we're friends.
Yeah.
I get a call when she's in town, and we go out for cocktails and talk. And usually we talk business for about 48 seconds, and then it's all gossip and showbiz, war stories, and whatever. But yeah, we initially met. We had mostly our contact at the beginning was I would write script and she would write back and say, here's my input. And God bless her, her input 99.999% of the time was, here are 2 new jokes for you to add on this page and this panel and this page and this panel. That was about it, mostly. And then she was doing a signing at Monsterpalooza, and I reached out to her manager and said, hey, do you mind if I come by and meet her? I think it would be good for PR for me to take a picture with her holding up the comic, whatever. So we did that a couple of times. And then during the pandemic, I was actually in the middle of writing the Vincent Price comic when the pandemic hit, and they called me up and said, put down your pen because there are no comic book stores open, so we don't know when this thing is going to go, but will you write a graphic novel or a 40-page comic that we'll do a Kickstarter and we'll do direct to fans? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. And they said, Cassandra actually wants to get on the phone with you and chat and talk about what you're going to do. And she has some story ideas. And we got on the phone, and she had great story ideas, but she really liked mine, which was making a satire of the Omega Man with COVID, basically, where COVID ends up turning people into zombies because they're drinking cleaning products because someone told them that was a good idea. I think it was her idea that the zombies should have bright orange skin. By the way, when I said, yeah, I think they should have blank eyes or something, she's like, oh, they should all have that horrible orange spray tan look. And I was like, oh yeah, that's
done.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Let's do that one. So we did. So we did a couple of books that way, but that opened up the gates of us actually talking. And then when I did the 3rd Kickstarter book was called Death of Elvira, and she was coming up on her 40th year doing Elvira. And I thought it would be fun to do Elvira dies, but not really, because it's a comic book, and does the private eye thing of shows up at her own wake in a disguise to hear people talking about her on the assumption that the murderer will be there and will out themselves. And that we use that as a vehicle for people from her entire life to tell her life story. And what I did was I took anecdotes from Cassandra's life and made them things that had happened to Elvira.
Yeah.
So Elvira as a little, so Gonk actually in Thought Balloons, like Snoopy, tells the story of Elvira as a little girl. And the great artist Sylvia Califano actually came up with the idea of drawing it in the style of Peanuts. So it's basically Lucy in a black dress with a big beehive hairdo, which is such a great solution. So that was so when we got together for that, I had called her up and said, I know you're working on your memoir. I can't wait for it to come out. Unfortunately, I got to write this now. So I need about 8 or 9 stories that I can put in this book, Death of Elvira. And she said to me, oh, David, that can't be a phone call. We gotta have cocktails in our hands while we're talking about that stuff. So we went to dinner at the Dresden Room. I brought my wife, who had always wanted to meet Cassandra, and my wife is a retired last dancer, so they had showgirl stuff to talk about together, and the science of tassel twirling and costume making and all of that. So they had a great time, and I got everything I needed to do that. So, but yeah, it's funny working with her and my other, one of my closest friends, if not my closest friend, is Kevin Eastman. It's funny what 1985 David would think about my life today. That I have hour-long phone calls with the guy who created the Ninja Turtles and with Elvira. That's my, that's my professional life.
Yeah.
It's conferring with those two incredible, icons from my college years, essentially.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people that can put that on the resume, and that's always fun to look back on.
I'm very, very fortunate to have met and worked with both of them.
Definitely. So before we wrap up in here, obviously we're looking forward to the 5 issues of Elvira meets H.P. Lovecraft, which everyone, if you haven't stopped by your LCS today, go pick it up. What else do you have in the works?
Well, that'll run 5 issues. What I had coming from Image in late April is a comic called Drawing Blood, which we did Kickstarter a while back, so some people have read it. But it's Kevin Eastman came to me with this basically pseudo autobiographical story about a comic creator from the early 90s who creates something that becomes a global phenomenon and has all the same sort of ups and downs and roller coaster that Kevin had. He starts a publishing company, an altruistic publishing company that fails, like Kevin did with Tundra. And just all of I think Kevin wanted a way to tell all of the great show business anecdotes that we've all amassed over the years, and find a way to tell those stories and tell a story about the inside workings of the comic book industry a little bit. And what it's like to walk down a street and see the thing you came up with in your bedroom when you were a teenager on a billboard being done as, the edgy new version of, the dark, gritty version of your Funny Animal strip from the 80s being out there in the world. So, it's called Drawing Blood, coming from Image, 12 issues. Artists on it are Ben Bishop, who people. And here's the thing: you say, "Oh wow," you only say, "Oh wow," because we hired Ben Bishop to draw Drawing Blood 4 or 5 years ago, and that led to him getting hired on The Last Ronin. That was, that's the people don't really know the backstory. I was in Kevin's home in San Diego talking about who was going to draw Drawing Blood, and he's like, there's this guy in Maine who has this graphic novel that he kickstarted called The Aggregate. And Kevin's wife, Courtney, was like, he's pretty good. Maybe he could do Drawing Blood. And so we got him dream job number 1, which was working with Kevin Eastman. And then during the pandemic, Kevin called me up and said, I know it's going to delay Drawing Blood number 2 by quite some time, but really need to borrow Ben for The Last Ronin. And I was like, okay, the Kickstarter supporters for Volume 2 are going to be mad at us, but they're going to be pretty happy about Last Ronin.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same audience, so maybe they'll be satiated by that. And another artist named Troy Little draws the hallucination scenes in it. I should say that the in-universe version of the Turtles is 3 cats who are girls and who aren't named after Renaissance painters. They're named after anime directors. So the gentle, poetic one is named Miyazaki. The really violent one is named Otomo. And the thoughtful leader is named Tezuka, creator of Astro Boy, for those who don't know. And we did that comic as well. We did the first issue of the Ragdoll, so we would sort of know what we were talking about and know what our hero Shane Bookman created. And also to push the meta framing of the comic a little bit further, we don't want anyone to believe that this is really the true story about the Ninja Turtles. So in the 4th issue, Shane Bookman runs into me and Kevin Eastman and Ben Bishop at a convention. And one of my favorite lines I've ever written, there's a character based on Michael Bay named Morgan Harbour, who says to Shane Bookman, "Is that who I thought it was?" And he says, "Yeah." And the character says, "Fuck that guy and fuck his fucking turtles." Which that is not. Kevin had a perfectly fine relationship with Michael Bay. I just thought it was a very funny thing to put in that character's mouth. But yeah, so that'll run 12 issues, and hopefully we'll do a second 12-issue series of it. But Image is very excited by it, and they're behind it 100%. There are other comics I have coming from Dynamite that have not been solicited yet, so I'm going to be careful talking about them.
Yeah.
But another 5-issue series about another iconic movie host personality, and no, I will not say who, but I'm on writing the 4th issue of that one right now. And there will also be an original graphic novel with the Elvira. Yeah, in the Elvira ballpark is the best I can say. And that'll be, I'm finishing it up now. I'm on page 121. And I told Dynamite I would keep it to 120 pages. So 130, 140 page OGN. That'll probably premiere on Kickstarter as well. And yeah, and watch Max and wait for my episodes of Bat Wheels to drop because they're great fun.
Awesome. We can't wait. Where's the best place for people to find you and keep up to date with what you're doing?
I have a website, davidavallonefreelance.com, and I hope post updates there on everything that I'm doing. And that branches off to all of the social medias, the Instagram and the Blue Sky, and you can find me on. I mean, also, I have a very easily Googleable name, so I can easily be found on any social platform. I always use my real name. I don't have any fake internet personas to sell. It's just, that's too much work.
Yeah,
honestly. So I'm happy to just be me. But and if you're in, I will be at WonderCon Anaheim. I have at least 3 panels at that, though I'm not tabling. And I'm sure Image will be making a splash with Drawing Blood at San Diego. There'll probably be some panels about it, and I imagine me, Kevin, and Ben will be signing at a booth somewhere. Probably me, Kevin, Ben, Troy, among others. And there's some media stuff floating in the upper atmosphere that I also can't talk about yet, but that'll be very exciting when it drops.
All right. Well, we can't wait to look forward to what you put out. Everyone, if you're watching this episode on YouTube, you can find this and the rest at Beyond the Cape, and you can find this in podcast version wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to have you back soon to talk about your next projects.
My pleasure.
All right.
Ryan. Thank you.
Everyone, have a good night.